Hello, everybody, and thank you all for joining us again here today for an SRD talk. This is a spin-off of our TTRPG talk series, but we're still going to be doing the exact same thing. We're going to be covering SRDs and Eddic and various TTRPG engines and things that you can use for making your own role-playing games. And today we're going to be taking a look at Eddic Engine. This is a system that was created a couple of years ago by Tracy Barnett, otherwise known on the internet as The Other Tracy. So let's go ahead and dive in. What exactly is the goal of the Eddic Engine? Well, in a short phrase, it's basically dramatic collective storytelling. What does this mean? Well, for one thing, the system is primarily built around the concept of GM-less capable play. Basically, the basic idea behind this is that the leader of the narrative, if there is a leader of the narrative, it's going to be shifting as you play. Basically, so some players, of course, might take on a more active role when it comes to making suggestions or taking on narrative or stuff like that, but it doesn't have to be the same person all the time. Of course, some groups might just feel more comfortable with a sort of game master style play, which is also fine. But generally, the system really is built around the idea of being GM-less. And the GM doesn't have any mechanical role, but rather instead would just be sort of shepherding the narrative, helping keep track of scenes and details and stuff like that. The second element of this sort of dramatic collective storytelling is that the focus is a lot more on the journey rather than the destination. The Eddic Engine system reference document actually kind of suggests that it's generally good to have a game where you kind of already know at least the basics of where the story is going to end and roughly how long you want to take to get there. Obviously, things can change as you go, but at the beginning, you have a basic idea of where you want to go. However, instead, that means, of course, that the story, the narrative that you're telling together is instead about the journey to get there, how we get to point A, from point A to point B, right? So, for example, let's say the game is about revolution, right? Maybe we've decided ahead of time that the revolution is going to fail and that this is going to be a more potentially have a dramatic element, have a more tragic dramatic element to it. So the question is, what is the journey going to be to where we get there? Is this going to be kind of just like a fizzle, right? Is the revolution going to fail because we end up creating an even worse sort of monster of a government than we had to begin with? Or does this end up failing in the short term, but succeeding in the long term because we've ended up creating a rallying cry for future movements and stuff like that? Both the narrative and the mechanics built around a concept of details. Now, let's go ahead and explore exactly what we mean by a detail. And Tracy basically describes detail as being elements of truth in the story, right? These are things that are definitely true. These are things that should be true and not in the sort of from a certain point of view sense, but rather they are fundamental truths of either the universe or the character or the setting or whatever, right? Now, these could be mutable. They could change. Characters, of course, change over long periods of time. Or a setting could be potentially changed because of the actions of characters. But in many cases, they are pretty much permanent, or at least are very stable. Details in general should be agreed upon mutually, especially if we're referring to details that are related to the setting and the scene as opposed to an individual character. Basically, this is more to make sure that things kind of fit and jive and work together, and also to make sure that we're not crossing any lines or veils when it comes to the types of things that people actually want in the story and in their game. These details, of course, can be used to build anything in the engine, whether they are settings, threats and opposition characters, the characters that the players will be portraying, and various other things. And again, of course, I already mentioned that the rule of three gives us enough detail to start without restricting future developments. Now, let's go ahead and start taking a look at some of the mechanics of how the Eddic Engine actually works. The engine is built on pools of 6-sided dice, mechanically. You are going to need a lot of D6s, ideally in 2 different colors, and we'll explain why in a couple of slides. But you're definitely going to need probably like 10 of one color and probably, I don't know, 15 or 20 of another. And like a lot of other pool-based systems, we're going to be trying to achieve a certain number of hits. So then the number for hits normally doesn't change. It's either going to be 5 or 6 on the 6-sided dice. This system does include exploding dice, which means, for those of you who aren't familiar, if you roll the highest value on a die, in this case, of course, a 6, then that counts as basically a hit in this system. And then you would roll the die again. So you could potentially get multiple hits off of just one die. The difficulty level for a roll, whenever you are rolling, is set somewhere between 1 and 10, where 1 is relatively trivial rolls where there is at least a small chance of failure, all the way up, or unless your character is just really bad at doing this and under severe pressure or disadvantage, or going all the way up to 10s, which are like, godly actions. And that's because the base pools that your players are going to generally be working with are somewhere between a 3d6 or a 10d6, or somewhere in between. And of course, there are modifiers that could potentially change the number of dice you're rolling. So just as an example, threats or opposition characters don't roll. Instead, basically, they would be influencing the rolls of others. So if my character, for example, is trying to bribe a guard, and that guard has a detail that says that they are incorruptible, then obviously my character is going to have a much harder time trying to convince this guard to take my bribe and look the other way. So that would means that my role to try to convince them is going to probably remove, probably more than one, probably more like 2 or 3 dice, just because of the difficulty of convincing that character to act against their nature. Now, speaking of increasing risk and stuff in a roll, another thing that the Eddic system generally tries to encourage players to do is being willing to embrace failure. Now, failure can occur on a roll specifically whenever you get fewer hits than the difficulty level, which of course means then you either fail or you get a partial success. Now, many systems out there, of course, have like value ratings for like a failure is rolling a 1 to 3, partial success is a 4, success is 5 to 6, or something like that. All right. This system doesn't do that. Instead, we have a full success and not full success, right? Because 5 or 6 is success. 1 through 4 is not, unless you have some special modifier. Now, as to whether or not it's a failure or a partial success is really decided instead by the player who's rolling and the group collectively, or whoever is currently like in charge of the narrative at this stage. And it's really more like a negotiation to figure out what would be best for the story, what makes most sense for this situation. So it partly is based on narrative and also partly based on just like what feels right for the moment. A player also can choose to fail on purpose before they roll. The Eddic Engine has a system where you can gain control points. And control points work a lot like, let's say, momentum or fate points or stuff like that in other systems where you can use them to help you re-roll certain dice in the pool that might have missed as opposed to hit. But also you can use it to add details to a scene or even notable details that could potentially affect multiple scenes that are built around a specific event that are the detail that you added, like something about a particular character. And these are things that could have narrative or mechanical elements to them. And also consequences of your failures or partial successes could be narrative. Like, obviously you tried to do something, you fail, that means the thing doesn't happen, right? Which could in itself be bad enough, right? Like trying to bribe that guard. But also, there could be mechanical reasons why. Let's say you just can't think of a narrative consequence to this particular thing. Well, then instead there's a mechanical system that allows you to do that instead. Or if you're not sure exactly when a sort of narrative consequence would kick in, there's a mechanical means of basically storing up that, let's say, bad vibes to unleash them later. So let's take a look at some of those mechanical consequences. The main way that the Eddic Engine does this is through the system called that Tracy calls glitch dice. Now, glitch dice are basically a separate pool of dice that your player will accumulate by failing or partial successes. So you gain glitch dice by, again, rolling under the difficulty number. So the total that you'll get is the difficulty number minus your hits. So again, if I roll 5, if I have a difficulty 5 roll and I only get 3 hits, that means I gain 2 glitch dice to my pool. Now, glitch dice are rolled alongside your regular dice. If you have any glitch dice in your pool, you go ahead and just roll the whole pool alongside any regular dice that you would roll for that. This is where it's important to have 2 different colors of dice, because of course you're going to need to be able to tell the difference between your glitch dice and your not glitch dice. The regular dice, of course, whenever you're rolling glitch dice, the regular dice just decide what happens with the roll, with the specific action that you're trying to do. But the glitch dice instead are basically determining how bad the complication is. So essentially, you could succeed, but there's still complications because of past events that occurred. So again, I try to bribe the guard. I get a partial success where, he agrees that he's going to kind of look away for the moment and he takes the money, right? But then later he tells people that, he tells people that I tried to bribe him, right? And there's going to be a consequence to that. So the complications are as a result of that element. Now these complications, depending upon how many hits you get, help determine the severity of the complication and also who it affects. So it could be affecting the specific character that is rolling all of these glitch dice, or it might make more sense for an ally to basically take on that consequence. So again, kind of going back to my example, the guard reports the fact that I tried to bribe them. My character has to do another roll later on. Or maybe another character rolls and they already had some glitch dice, and they come up with glitch dice. Let's say they roll 2 hits on their glitch dice, which means that there's a minor consequence that affects one of their allies. And let's say, oh, well, it makes sense for me to be the ally. Let's say somebody recognizes me based on the description that was given. Or at least suspects, and so that means they're more suspicious. They're asking me questions, they're probing, and so it's hard for me to do what I need to do. So in some ways, you could think of this as being like the Vampire the Masquerade, the most recent system of Vampire the Masquerade, the hunger dice that are used in that system, where you sometimes get like messy successes. So yeah, that's where like maybe you get glitch dice and succeeding at the same time. Once glitch dice have been rolled, they're gone. So they don't like stay static in a pool that slowly accumulates bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger over the course of the game. No, once you roll them, they're gone. Now, one thing that is important to note is that if you have glitch dice in your pool, you cannot get any new control points. So you can't fail on purpose and get control points if you already have glitch dice. You have to roll. And if you do decide to try to fail in order to get control points, you do still get glitch dice even though you didn't roll. You're just getting the total of the difficulty since it counts as being a 0-hit roll because you didn't actually try. Characters, of course, are incredibly important for storytelling. And in this system, basically the players are controlling what are referred to as spotlight characters. Now, they're not called player characters, and that's partly because it encourages you to potentially switch around who's playing whom Just because a character is not currently the lens of the narrative at the moment doesn't mean they couldn't become one later. So it's important for pretty much all characters that could be significant to the story. So obviously random guard number 3, you don't need to necessarily worry about details for that person, but like notable characters that you're that either are going to be a threat or opposition, or potentially could become a player character, a spotlight character themselves, should have at least those 3 details developed, just to make it simpler and easier, so that when a character does decide to, the player does decide to take on that character as a spotlight character, then that means that they can get up and can start the next scene pretty much right away without necessarily having to develop a whole lot. Another consequence of being able to potentially switch characters from scene to scene, or from element of story, like maybe from session to session, is that control points and glitch dice follow the player and not the character. I mentioned that all of them should have at least 3 details, but what is the anatomy of a spotlight character, like one that was developed from the ground up to be a player played character? Well, obviously some of these things are pretty obvious. Your character's obviously going to need a name. Your character's going to have a look. Those are pretty notable. However, there are 4 other things that your character is going to need to help describe them, not only for the other players, but also help build up the mechanical elements of their character. The first is an archetype. Then we have a gender, and I'll explain that in a bit. It's probably not what you think. I already mentioned that every character should have 3 details. One reason for that is because basically when you're creating your character, you're going to, when you create the details, you're also going to assign them a value of excellent, good, or okay. And this decides how many dice that you'll roll whenever that detail is coming into play in the narrative. So for example, if I'm playing in an old Western game and my character has, fastest iron in the West, that means they probably have an excellent rating for that skill whenever they are using it to, or the detail, whenever they're using, whenever they're, shooting things or being really fast at doing stuff, things like that. Or being quick also to recognize danger, and anything basically that you might expect would be important for gunslinging, let's say. And of course, every character also has 3 pieces of gear. So again, referring back to that same character, presumably if they're the fastest iron in the West, that means they have a piece of iron, right? That means they have a gun. They have got a 6-shooter. And so that could be one of their pieces of gear. Whenever your character is utilizing that piece of gear, they gain an extra die in their pool. However, also on the flip side, there are, of course, certain situations where a character might have a disadvantage because of a piece of gear. So for example, I'm trying to look, I'm that gunslinger, and I'm trying to look non-threatening, and I'm trying to convince people that there's no danger, that everything's fine, everything's calm, but I'm standing here with a giant gun on my hip. It's probably going to undermine my attempts a little bit to try to calm down the situation. So that might be a situation where I might lose a die from my pool instead of gaining it because of the piece of gear. Now let's go ahead and dive into the 2 elements that I mentioned that we'll talk about a little bit later. The first one being the archetype. Now, archetypes in this game, in Eddic Engine games, basically are like a profession, a trade, or a general skill set that would be coming from the character's past experiences, the culture they're from, their background, ancestry, so on and so forth. So in some ways, you could think of this as being like a class or a playbook. These will generally be created by whoever is making the game, and they'll generally want to be tailored toward the setting or the genre. So for example, if you're creating like a Lovecraftian based game, you're going to want to have your femme fatale, your investigator, your cultist, your archaeologist, that kind of stuff, the journalist, the usual classic tropes that you might expect. For other games, you might actually want to have multiple archetypes. Maybe there's 2 archetypes that kind of work together where the characters are going to be pulling from. Each of these archetypes come with a recommended list of genders, which again we'll explain in a moment, and 3 abilities that can influence various actions or dice rolls. And many of those abilities should be written in a way that kind of describes them as basically whenever certain thing triggers, then X event happens. And these abilities have like 3 different levels. There's at need, which are basically abilities you can use at any time. Per scene, which of course means, again, you can only use them once per scene. And per session. And basically, and these of course should scale in power appropriately, with obviously per session abilities being significantly more impactful both mechanically and narratively than at need abilities. So just as an example, one of the examples that Tracy included in the Eddic Engine manual, the Eddic Engine system reference guide, was as an example of an at need ability. There's one here called Always a Blade on hand, where basically it says, unless you are stripped of all your clothing and possessions, you will always have a knife as an extra piece of gear. Treat this as you would treat any other piece of gear. So essentially, basically, this at need ability just gives you an extra piece of gear that doesn't count towards your 3. Now, let's go ahead and take a look at exactly what we mean by the gender of your character. The Eddic Engine describes gender as being, and this is my interpretation of it, as being a statement about how this character presents themselves in the world and how they are perceived both by themselves and by others. Now, this is a kind of statement that harkens back to the sort of original use of gender in English to describe the subclasses of things. So, for example, like forms of grammar, right? So you have genders of nouns or verbs or whatever. The examples of gender phrases in the manual are very poetic and sort of alliterative. They're not literal. And basically, whenever you are creating your archetypes, you should create like a list of like 5 or 6 examples. But of course, you can create a new one for your character whenever you're making it. You don't necessarily have to follow those. So in the Eddic Engine, there is a character who is... The character's named Greeble Handsworth. They're a detective that's from Goblin Town, right? So those are their 2 archetypes. And this character feels to me a lot like they're a goblin, right? And so the gender that was given to this character was the last sip of whiskey from a dented flask. They've clearly been around for a long time. They've seen a lot. They're rough around the edges, but they're goblins, so it's not like a gravelly deep voice, but they've got that sort of buzz in their voice because either they've been smoking a lot or they've been drinking so much that it's given them that sort of growl in their throat and stuff like that. And you can almost kind of get a feeling for that character. If we're talking about like a gunslinger, then maybe we've got some ways you could describe that. Maybe it's a dusty sunset. That's the kind of elements that they're thinking about with gender, with the way gender is described in this game. So, and again, these are the gender. It does not like determines more of like the presentation and the personality and how they're perceived, both by themselves and by the world. Like I mentioned, this isn't mechanical. This is more narrative. What kind of games do I think I can make with this? Well, obviously, games that I would make with this would be ones that are built around cinematic storytelling, as we already mentioned. This is a game system, again, because it has opportunities where players and characters are not necessarily strongly attached to each other and can bounce around whenever they want. This does adapt well to large casts, TV shows or stuff like that with a large group of characters. And they don't necessarily, and those large number of characters, they don't even need to necessarily be strongly attached to one another, which we'll explore in a little bit. Another thing that a game created using this system would really be dependent on is drama over gritty action. As I kind of allude to in the last bullet there on the slide, this is not ideal for like heavy blow by blow sort of style combat that you'd have like in D&D or something like that. Instead, this is really more intended for, I mean, you could do combat using this system, but again, it's going to be very theater of the mind narrative. And again, we're going to have a lot more focus on things like drama and social elements and stuff like that, as opposed to action. This is not a strategy game for sure, unless your strategy is manipulating like factions and stuff like that. This particular system also would be very strong at episodic storytelling, because there isn't already a sort of built-in strong system for character advancement. There is, so that I would like, for example, this would not necessarily be ideal also for games where you see a lot of growth in your character, in individual characters, and it would be in part because there is such a strong emphasis on more characters as opposed to a few well-developed characters. Another thing that this system would be really good for is telling non-linear stories, parallel stories, and stories with large gaps. So by that, what I mean, non-linear storytelling, of course, would be because the characters don't change that much mechanically, you could tell a story where, like, literally the first scene is the last thing that happens in the story. And the rest of it's basically just a giant flashback. Right? Like I mentioned with that revolution, maybe the very first scene of the story that your group tells, if the revolution ended badly, maybe one of the spotlight characters is standing in a room and they're watching riots out the window and things are burning, and then another character walks in the room and like demands their surrender, and all of a sudden we smash cut to, let's say, I don't know, 2 years ago, and then all of a sudden we basically kind of go into how we went from where we want our characters to start to where we feel things have ended. Again, parallel storylines, as I mentioned, the different characters that the players are playing don't actually have to be that strongly connected to each other. In fact, they could even be on opposite sides of a conflict. If you want to do a story where, again, maybe it's a war story or something like that, and you have, characters on one side and characters on the other, or maybe, again, kind of tying into war story themes, maybe you have like a story where you have a group of characters who are at home and they're dealing with stuff on the home front, and you have another group of characters who are like soldiers in the war, and they're having to deal with the actual direct conflict and how that shapes and stuff. And so, of course, you're telling two separate stories at the same time. And yes, sometimes they might cross to one another because somebody comes home on shore leave or whatever. You get letters going back and forth and stuff like that. So yeah, there's still probably some crossover and connection, of course, between the groups. They're not completely disconnected. They're both influencing the same narrative and are taking part in the same narrative, but they're not like, they're parallel. They're not directly connected to one another. Those are just some games that I can think of that you might want to potentially create using the Eddic Engine. For those of you who are potentially interested in this system, there is a game that has come out already using this system called Iron Edda Reforged. That was actually the second or third version, actually, I think, of that game, because I think it was originally developed for Fate Core and then Fate Accelerated. Again, by Tracy Barnett, otherwise known as the other Tracy. So I'll share itch page links for both. I'm actually seriously considering making a game with this system, actually, in the very near future. So keep an eye out for that. Don't forget to, of course, subscribe, ring the bell, notification bell, all that jazz. Don't forget to also follow me on Itch if you want to potentially find out about future games and stuff like that might be happening. Thank you all for joining us again here today on Hudson County. Have a good zone, and don't forget to rate your Itch purchases.